All right, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. It's 11 o'clock by my watch in Chicago, so it's time to begin. Thank you for attending this PowerCast workshop, PowerHA and Robot HA with Tom Huntington and Brian Nordland of Help Systems. This PowerCast is sponsored by Help Systems. My name is Ian Cartwright. I'm Education Manager for Common, and if you experience any technical issues during the presentation, send me a message through chat. If you'd like to send a written question to Brian or Tom, go ahead and use the Q&A area. They will answer your questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. Presenting today are Tom Huntington and Brian Nordland. Tom Huntington is Executive Vice President of Technical Solutions at Help System and has been named an IBM champion for the last 6 years. He oversees business alliances and large customer relationships and ensures that Help System software works with other major software and hardware vendors worldwide. Also presenting today is Brian Nordland. Brian's a technical product manager for PowerHA and Robot HA at Help Systems. He's spoken at events, webinars, and users groups, including Common since 2014. He's a co-inventor on multiple patent applications and co-author on technical publications in high availability and distributed computing. Tom and Brian, go ahead and take us away.
Well, thank you, Ian, and welcome everyone. We're very excited to be with you. Brian, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Tom. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. Well, we have an exciting agenda for you. We're going to do a little PowerPoint and we're going to do some live demo today for PowerHA and journaling type technology, and then wrap it up with a little bit of talk around monitoring and some of the things that are out there for monitoring. But before we get into that, it's always good to kind of hear what's on your mind. We have a polling question here. What are you using for high availability today? Logical replications, software-based, using journaling. PowerHA, which often is referred to as hardware-based replication with independent auxiliary storage pools. SAM-based replication, either with IBM technology or some other provider where you're simply doing hardware replication. Or maybe you're just doing your restores from backups and you don't really have what we would call a high availability real-time kind of DR solution in place, or maybe you're not sure and you don't know what's running at your organization. That's possible too. Brian and I both spend a lot of time helping customers educate them on all the different options that are out there. And, really that's what we're doing today. So thank you, Ian, for that first polling question. All right, let's take a look here. All right, well, the big one is 73% are using some form of software-based replication. All right, thank you. And then looks like SAM-based replication is next at 45%, PowerHA 27%, and restoring from backups 27%. And everybody out there is sure about what they're doing. So that's good to see. And let's move on to our PowerPoint here and talk about high availability options that are on IBM I. And the good thing about the IBM I operating systems is you have options, and that's probably true for a lot of different things, from developing new applications, and certainly that is the case here too when it comes to high availability. We've heard a lot since IBM 7.4 came out, and the topic of DB2 Mirror for IBM I is a new feature or new application that runs on the platform. It's certainly not free. You do have to buy it. But what this is replication based within pretty much the same data center, and you need to have two physical boxes for providing this. But this is IBM's technology for what I would call true high availability, where there is zero downtime because of a role swap, right? And this came out in 7.4, and it's still fairly new technology for most of us. And what you need to really understand is this is what they call synchronous replication. So in other words, if we look at node 1 in the same data center, node 1 is updating a record, and it's, as you can see here, it's Fred 24. Fred 24 goes into the database on node 1. And before that record is written, it's also going into the database on node 2. That's the premise behind DB2 Mirror for IBM I. And the thing that's in the middle there, ROCE or ROCE, is basically a special cable that IBM has to help provide the high-speed replication between the two systems. Brian, any additional thoughts related to this?
One of the other things to point out with DB2 Mirror is it is frequently when you do look at it combined with other technologies, be it either your software-based replication or hardware-based replication technologies for the purpose of giving you a disaster recovery system at a different location.
Very good point. Yes, right. So again, the point on this technology is a couple things. One, you need 2 IBM I servers, and you need to consider that this is within the same data center. So it is, yes, high availability, but it's not the DR piece. So thank you, Brian. Let's move on to our next option for you, and that's PowerHA. And Brian, I know this is really something that you spend a lot of time working on.
Yeah, so with PowerHA, one of the things I always like to talk about is it is a proven technology that's been around for over a decade. There are thousands of installations of it worldwide. The picture over on the right that we have has a lot of words to it, but the good news is that we're going to go through some of that in more depth over the next several minutes. But PowerHA falls under a series of technology that we call hardware replication, or you may also hear of it referred to as block level replication. When we originally designed PowerHA, we looked at the system and realized that it was really good at writing data to disk and then booting up from that disk. And so we thought, well, if we can just replicate that disk somewhere else, we can use that same kind of business as usual concept for the system for high availability. Now, that being said, we wanted to ensure that you could separate the operating system from your business and application data so that you can have independent operating systems that are running on both sides that can be updated independently. Therefore, as part of configuring PowerHA, you isolate your application data into something called an Independent Auxiliary Storage Pool, or IASP. And you can think of that maybe perhaps similar to, say, like a USB drive that you might plug into your PC. You save some of your stuff to it, you can unplug it and plug it into another PC. The good news is on IBM I, most users and many applications are completely unaware that the data is actually located somewhere different. Now, something to keep in mind is that because this is block level replication, while the replication is active, you can only access that data on the current primary node. You can always stop the replication and bring it online on both, for example, to perform backups off of the target system. PowerHA can be used with both internal storage and external SAN storage. It is a licensed product, meaning it does require its own license. It is something you have to purchase. And the last thing I want to mention here is that PowerHA is actually a family of solutions. And so you can really kind of customize it to your needs. Some of the common ones are geographic mirroring, which is a technology where the system does the replication. This is great because it works with any type of storage, including if you have, say, a target system that's in the cloud. But as you get to larger and larger sizes of data, it can be nice to offload that replication to something else. So if you have IBM SAN storage, we typically start to see that you can integrate PowerHA with those SAN storage technologies, such as Metro Mirror or Global Mirror. So I think next we have Tom up to talk about logical replication.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, let's move on to logical replication. This is, Brian put down that, PowerHA has been around for over a decade, which to me makes it a very stable technology and something that a lot of people are using around the globe. Logical replication technically goes back to the System 38 days when journaling first came to the System 38. Since then, IBM has enhanced this technology to build in what they call remote journaling. So when we first started, we had this local journaling technology, and then remote journaling came out. Now that's been around for at least 2 decades too. I'm not going to go beyond that. 2 decades is plenty of time for me technology wise, but the purpose here is your database, as you update changes to your database, your data areas, your data queues, your IFS, kind of those dynamic things that are always changing in real time. The system is recording that in a journal. A copy of those instances or records are flying across to a remote journal. And then your typical HA technology is reading that information coming off the remote journals and applying them to your database. So the idea is within nanoseconds, provided your communication lines and stuff are keeping up with the transactions, your databases between the two are in sync. And really, quite honestly, there's not really a limitation on the this place called the planet called Earth, as far as how far apart your IBM I servers can be. Then the other aspect of it is a lot of the applications are using Q Audit Journal to read many other changes that are happening to your business applications, like a new program, a new job description, authority changes, new user profiles. Items like that are coming out of Q Audit Journal that are being read either real time or as a periodic type function. What then those technologies do is some kind of save operation. A save operation is happening on a production system. TCP/IP is generally being used to send the objects over the target, restore them, and put them in place. And really, since the announcement of the AS400 platform and before, as we learned today, journaling has been around. The remote journaling has probably been around since like the mid to late 90s. So not new technology, very rock solid from a standpoint of been around and been proven and used by many customers around the globe. Now, Brian, I know that customers can combine these technologies, as you talked about, even with DB2 Mirror. You are going to be required to use things like PowerHA or data replication with that technology in order to cover everything that you do. In this example here, we have PowerHA running between two systems. The independent auxiliary storage pools are being used. PowerHA is replicating those to a target set of IASP or volumes that are not active. So one of the challenges becomes people want to maybe do query and look at that data from a purpose of building out business intelligence data or AI data, whatever you want to call it these days. And they might use a tool like Robot HA or some local journal-based solution with remote journaling to send the data over to another partition. They also might use a software-based replication tool to replicate system utilities, or maybe some application that for whatever reason you can't load it into independent auxiliary storage pools. Typically, I see system utilities, your security tools, your scheduling tools, your monitoring tools are kind of the things that I typically see that stay in the system base when it comes to PowerHA. I guess, Brian, any other additional thoughts on this one in combination?
I don't have too much to add to that. You did a great job, Tom.
Okay.
But again, I've also seen this used where you start extending things to perhaps maybe more systems or things into the cloud as well.
Oh, sure. And let's not mislead you either. There are customers that only have PowerHA and that's all they have. It just really depends upon your environment. Okay, so then next, some other things to think about, and is a technology called live partition mobility. And I guess I will give this also that 10-year stamp. LPM has been around on the power server for IBM I anyways for a decade and longer if you're using other operating systems like AIX. But the idea behind here is this is a method of being able to, within the system, to be able to move a partition from one partition to another without ending the users. So it really truly is live partition mobility, but this is truly kind of a high availability solution for LPAR maintenance, hardware maintenance, but it's not DR because it's happening within that same frame or same infrastructure. And we're getting comments right now. Some customers said, hey, I've used LPM just last night and moved 6 LPARs. It's an excellent tool. So if you're not using it, and some other things that I hear about is things like flash copy. People are doing those things where they're replicating data from one system to another. Then there's also some technology called full system recovery, or FSR, full system replication. I think I got fully up there, so I notice these things as we actually talk about them. But full system replication, where system A is active and system B is inactive, and you're basically doing a full storage replication solution. So then if you want to bring it up on the other side, now you're looking at doing an IPL or something like that to bring it up. So certainly there's disadvantages with that, and Speaking of that, I know, Brian, I think you could talk to this chart all day. This is more of a reference material, but you put this together to help people compare all these different solutions and what is covered. What are you presenting here?
Yeah, great point, Tom. And we aren't going to go into this in detail, and we could actually expand this chart quite a bit more. But I wanted to put this up because, you know, sometimes as we start looking at these, it becomes, you know, kind of like, well, this one does this one does that. So this is just starting to put them together to show how different technologies can help you solve different problems. Along the top here, I put different types of outages, things like a hardware outage, or perhaps a software outage, such as needing to install PTFs for the latest security patches. And then along the left-hand side, I put some various technologies that we mentioned today. Something that, you know, to really keep in mind is that you can combine these technologies. So live partition mobility, since we did talk about that just a minute ago, is an example of one that you might go, well, there's only one thing checked off here, but it is a great solution for solving that one problem, and you can easily combine it with just about any one of the other technologies on this chart. So that was really all I wanted to talk about as far as this goes.
All right, thank you, Brian. Yeah, and that's very true, is that, you know, something like LPM is always used with a good solid backup solution. You know, I mean, you still can't get away from things like either doing flash copy or other backups. It's just a very common thing to do and a very important thing to do. So let's have you talk, Brian, a little bit more about PowerHA and how to verify that it's working and how to navigate it.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the great things about PowerHA being a hardware replication solution is that it does require very little ongoing monitoring and maintenance. That being said, you still do have to look at a few things. One of the first things is ensuring that PowerHA is active. PowerHA relies on a technology called clustering, which combines several systems together to enable a single point of monitoring and control, which is great because oftentimes you can do all of this monitoring from one system, but you do need to start clustering, particularly after you start the system up. Once clustering is active, PowerHA has a concept called the administrative domain, and this is for synchronizing security and configuration related objects, things like user profiles, so that as I change my password on one system, it is changed across the cluster. And then also PowerHA has a concept called a cluster resource group, or CRG, which is what you use to switch resources across the cluster. And so you do need to start that as well. And once everything is, you know, kind of active, all the jobs are running, the couple other things we have to look at is everything good with the replication? For example, with the administrative domain, we have to look and see, are all of the resources consistent? And then we have to look at our disk-based replication, which we look at a session. The great news is that with hardware replication, it's either going or it isn't. So there's really only one piece to monitor with that aspect. And then perhaps one of the biggest questions with any high availability technology is, are we replicating everything that we need to? With PowerHA, the biggest ones there are there any new security or configuration objects that we haven't put in the admin domain? And then have we added any new libraries or applications that we haven't put into the independent ASP? There are a number of interfaces for kind of going through and managing or monitoring this. Through the green screen, we have the work clue command, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. And then we also have SQL services that we've recently introduced that enable you to easily kind of automate much of this monitoring. So before I do go through a live demo, I do want to talk about one of the features that's available now in 7.4 that's related to the administrative domain. When you create an administrative domain in 7.4, we actually set things up to be automated by default. For those of you moving up to 7.4, you can kind of customize and add policies for this to suit your needs. But some of the highlights are that when you create a new user on the system, PowerHA will automatically add it to the administrative domain and synchronize it across the cluster. When you delete a user from a node in the cluster, PowerHA can propagate that deletion across the cluster to ensure everything stays secure. We also have added some ways to easily find missing resources from the admin domain, and then added some automation for analyzing profile usage information across the cluster so that you can disable inactive profiles only when they're considered inactive across your entire environment. I think with that, let's get to a live demo. So I will share my screen here.
Brian, I'll do you a favor and let you know when your screen comes up and I can see it on my end. All right, looks like we got it.
All right, so I have two systems here. On the left is a system called prod, and on the right, I have a system called HA. I have them in different colors here just to ensure I don't do something on the wrong system. For those of you who are new to PowerHA, one of the first places to go is a menu called Work Clue. And so today I'll just start from this menu and kind of work down it. Option 1 on this menu is to display information about the cluster. And this contains much of the same types of information as some of these other screens where we can work with things. So I'm going to skip over that for now, and we can kind of see it through some of these work screens. Option 6, the next one on the menu, is to work with the list of cluster nodes. I'm going to go in there now, and here we can see that I have two systems or nodes in my cluster. I have prod and HA, and they both have a status of active. If one wasn't active, I could use option 8 here to start that node, and it would start up clustering on that node. And I can do that even if I want to start the node that I'm not on. If I come back to the menu and start working down it further, we have administrative domains. So if I go there, that's option 8. Again, this is for working with security and configuration related objects. It also has a status. And so this is something after we end clustering everywhere and we start it back up, we'll need to start the administrative domain. In this case, it is active, but I could, again, start it with option 8 if it wasn't active. Within the administrative domain, when it is active, we have resources that are being synchronized. So things like user profiles. And we can monitor those by looking at option 7 here, which is monitored resources. And I could filter these and so forth if I'd like. I'm going to take the defaults and just hit enter. If there was a problem with a monitored resource, it would show up in this global status column, and it would show something other than consistent. It might show a status of inconsistent, meaning for some reason we had a challenge synchronizing it. For example, maybe it was a user profile and the user changed their password, but we had implemented a password, some password rule policy changes recently and hadn't gotten that implemented across the cluster, so the password wasn't valid on all the nodes. And so that's really kind of all we have to do. The nice thing is, although I can have many resources in here, PowerHA does put the ones that have a problem up at the top by default. Now, one of the things we might wonder is if we have all of our users monitored by PowerHA. This system is set up to automatically add them, so they should all be in there. But I'm going to kind of force condition by just removing a couple of these user profiles from the admin domain so that they're no longer in there. And to add a resource to the administrative domain, I could do it from here and do add. I'm going to go to the command line though, and we can use the command add cad MRE. And to specify the resource, one of the things you can do is you can say, I want to add all user profiles. If I wanted to, if I had certain ones that I omit from the admin domain for some reason or another, I can specify those here, but I'm going to hit enter. And it's going to find the resources on this system that are not in the admin domain and allow me to add them. So I'll just confirm that, and they'll get added into the admin domain. Again, if I were to create a new user on the system, this one is configured to automatically add them to the admin domain. But if I kind of just create one here, a demo user of some sort, set whatever other fields I'd need to set. If I go back to my administrative domain and work with these monitored resources, one of the things we'll see is that user is now on my in the admin domain. And if I come over to my HA system and just look at all the user profiles, we'll see that the user is actually over there as well. Let's say this user A demo leaves the company and we're deleting their user. Oops. If I say to delete them, one of the things that we'll see is that that user is removed from the admin domain. To come in here. So it's no longer there. And if I come over to my HA system, we'll see that that user disappeared off of this system as well. So as you can see, the admin domain is fairly automatic, but I showed you a couple ways that you can kind of still do some cross checks if you'd like. One of the next steps in terms of looking at PowerHA is really looking at our business data. And so if I go back to this work with cluster menu and working down it, that is with a cluster resource group or CRG. Here we see that we have a CRG. It has a status of active. If it wasn't, I could start it. When you start a CRG, this is where PowerHA starts some of our automated health checks and monitoring of the replication. For our internal storage replication, you do have to start the CRG as well to start up that replication. Within a CRG, we have what's called a recovery domain, which is a list of nodes. And so if I do option 6 on here, we can see that I have 2 nodes in here. Currently, I have a node prod, which is the primary, and I have a node HA, which is the first backup. And if I had other nodes that I could switch to, they would be in here as well. And this status of active in here is telling me that things are ready to switch. PowerHA does perform some automated health checks on a regular basis. Currently at about 15-minute intervals, it'll go out to, say, external storage, go check everything out, and update the status if something went suspended, for instance. I'm just going to go over to another system here and just change something so we can see that get updated. In PowerHA, we manage the replication through something called a session. And to get to that, we can go to option 2, which is work with ASP copy descriptions as they make up part of the session. And then I can take an option 25 on any one of these lines in this environment. And this screen has a lot on it because we work to pull kind of everything together on this screen. But some of the important stuff that it shows is the copy status, which is an arrow representing our current replication status. It also shows things such as what our current recovery point objective is on the panel. But one of the things I can do here is if I hit F7 to change the session, I can suspend my replication, for instance. And what this is going to do is now this copy status has a slash through it, indicating that replication is not currently running. The next time that PowerHA runs its automated health check on things, what we'll start to see is that the CRG changes this status in the recovery domain to ineligible. After I resolve the problem, so in this case, I'm going to resume replication. As PowerHA goes through and runs its automated health checks again, eventually within 15 minutes of replication going active again, we would see that change to active. So that's kind of the quick version of navigating and manually monitoring PowerHA. It took me probably about 10 minutes or so to go through all of this, along with demonstrating some of that new automation of the admin domain. If I was to go through all of it, really quickly through it, checking if clustering is active, admin domain is active, are all the resources in the admin domain consistent? Is the CRG active? Does the recovery domain have a status of active? And that final check of this session, and if that's active, And we can probably do that in a minute or two. So it becomes very quick to monitor this even manually. In a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit about how you can make that even quicker with some automation. So with that, back over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Brian. Very nice job there. Let me take over the presentation here and move on to our next topic. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, we see it.
Oh, great. Awesome. So let's talk about journaling software and how you can verify and navigate some of that. Now, not every product is the same, I'm going to warn you, but under the covers, again, they're using journaling and remote journaling and some apply jobs over on the target side to apply them. And then they're also more than likely using the audit journal to find things like profiles, authority changes, program objects, and other objects that are on the system. So some might try to do this real time, and some products out there will do it interval oriented. I'm going to talk towards our product and what we do, but nonetheless, you should be able to navigate this. And so typically when you're looking at journaling on IBM I, and again, even with DB2 Mirror and even with PowerHA, you might still have some form of journaling on your system. So in order to look at the actual contents of a journal and what's being put in there, whether it's a record, update, delete, change, whatever that may be, or a new file being added to a library, you can do a display journ command against the journal, look at the content of it, somewhat read it, but it can be difficult to read because a lot of the data is stored in hexadecimal formats. But I will also say there are utilities out there that can read even journals to make them a little more friendly out there. And we certainly have something like that. And I am sure there's some other vendors out there too. Then the other aspect of it is working with the journal itself with the work journal attribute command, which allows you to see the attributes of the journals and the journal receivers, and also to be able to see the remote journal information. Okay. Now, promising live demo here. Let's take a look at one of our systems here. And I'm going to just simply go into Robot HA to start out with, and this will allow you to go in where we define the attributes. So I can go into one of my libraries. I can take, we'll just start with the overall attributes of the journal. So this is using the IBM I work journal command, and we can see things like the name of the current attached journal receiver, the name of the journal, what library it's working with, and then we can go, we can see some other things and with the max option 2 and minimum entry type functions that we have on the system. And some other things we can do is I can do F17. I can display the attached journal information and see when it was attached. All right. We can do, if I do F12 from here, then we can also do F19 to see what objects are actually being journaled. And there's a couple different options here. 30 will show you all the object types that are being journaled, data areas, data queues, along with your files. Typically, most of us are most worried about our physical files. This is a smaller library for demo purposes, but we can see that these physical files are being journaled here. If we press enter, I'm going to go back into that too. One more little kind of unique thing here is that we can also see is the library being journaled, because one of the commands I want to show you is the start journal live command that you may or may not be aware with. So we're actually journaling the library, which means that any object that's eligible for journaling is automatically going to be journaled when it's added to the library itself. Again, kind of one of those ease of use things. Now, if I do F24 here, one of the things that we'll see is, I should see F16, so it must be another F24. Yes, F16, I can see my remote journal information. Okay, so if I press F16, you will see the name of the remote journal and where it's stored, and then whether or not it's active. Very important, as Brian talked about status of things, we need to make sure that a remote journal is active. And then over on the target system, there's going to be a job that's reading that journal receiver content as it's coming in. The other thing too is there is a concept of asynchronous, and that's typically what people do when it comes to remote journaling. Similar to PowerHA, PowerHA has synchronous replication and asynchronous replication. Asynchronous is generally what most people do whenever they are concerned about performance of the production server that they're replicating. It just basically says, hey, just keep sending stuff over there. Whereas synchronous says, hey, we have to wait before we write the next transaction, and performance can be an impact. Hence, DB2 Mirror is using synchronous because they want to guarantee that everything's in sync real time before we move on to the next transaction. I mean, that's me breaking it down into a very simple kind of way of looking at it. All right, so now the next thing we want to do is display journal. And there's an option 10 here for display journal. And this is just using the basic IBM I display journal command. And you could prompt this command anywhere, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But we can see here are some puts. I just happen to know that a PT means that a record was added. So all these different journal types have a different code that represents what's being written. Just the same thing you'll see when you do a display of the audit journal entries. You'll see different audit journal entries in QAudjourn. This is showing you in relationship to a file being journaled. So the other thing we can do is we do have some other commands that you might find helpful, like F10 to be able to display the information as it's being written, what time, what user. But you'll see things like file member added and file member journaled, and just a variety of so I think this is actually the one up here is member saved as the RS type. Let me look here once. Yeah, user generated entry code coming in there from somebody else. So those things are going in. Now, again, if we do F21 here and go to a command line, display journ is a handy little command, but there's a lot of parameters on here that you can use to, you can go down to looking at certain sequence numbers, certain journal receiver ranges, down to pulling out based on a job or certain journal code values, as we were just showing you, for being able to pull those out too, entry types, etc., user profiles. So this command is, it's kind of a query green screen tool if you want to look at it that way. It's not necessarily the most friendly thing in the world, but it does give you that access into the information. Now, if I do F3 out of here, I wanted to show you the start journal lib command. What's nice about this is that I can specify an entire library in here, or multiple libraries if I wanted to. I could take that same library, point it to a journal in my journal lib, and then I could say, what object types do I want? And so by default, when somebody adds a physical file to that library, oops, I want to get my little thing out of there so we can see a cursor. I can press F4 here, and I can see the various object types that can be added to the journal. Okay. So that's some basic navigating tips for journaling. With this technology, you also have the ability to see, the journal as far as the number of records and stuff that have gone through it too. So let's switch back now over to our PowerPoint again and move on to the monitoring aspect of it and talk about some of the different monitoring options that you have out there too to think about. Okay, so just some really, every application that you own, there's generally going to be something in QSysOper that you want to look at. PowerHA sends messages over there, right, Brian?
Yes, it does.
Not to throw you on the spot, but yes, you send messages over there. When we get into the software replication, I keep going a little too far here. When we talk about software replication, certainly we're putting things in QSysOper, but then we generally will have jobs and subsystems that also need to be running. In the case of PowerHA, there's some system jobs that are out there running, right? And and those kinds of things that need to be up. But traditional kind of your journal-based replication always has jobs, always have subsystems that you should think about when it comes to monitoring. Now, in the case of PowerHA, I know Brian and his team has added additional SQL services. So from any of your BI type tools where you can specify SQL, or if you're used to using SQL from other tools or other applications, you can kind of build in some of your own monitoring capabilities. At Help Systems, we've built in monitoring into some of our various tools. Robot Monitor has it built in, and I'll show you some of those options. Halcyon has templates in it. You can configure these things in our free Insight tool that I'll show you here in a bit. And then also, certainly for those who have the robot solutions, you can use Robot Council to monitor jobs and subsystems also. Brian, any additional tips on monitoring?
I don't think I have any to show.
Okay. So with Robot Monitor, which is a graphical-based real-time performance monitoring tool, it's looking at things every 30 seconds, basically. Over the years, we've added in the ability to use Robot Monitor to monitor PowerHA. So we have built into it just call them widgets, call them options, but configured items array that you can just choose, and we'll bring in some of those things that Brian talked about, like admin domain and cluster resource group monitoring and so forth. But we also have Robot HA tied in here, so that if you have that product, it's brought in here. And of course, you can do individuals jobs and subsystem monitoring. And then we even have tools like Mimics in here that are tied in so that you can do real-time monitoring of your data groups and those kinds of things, because we realize you might have a combination of this technology. We do need to support all those things. So here is an example of the PowerHA cluster monitoring that we have in the technology. You might want to monitor the CPU, the disk space percent, so you can build a separate dashboard related to the various technologies that you have. And then, of course, here we're mimicking some errors that you would see, some warning type events here about cluster resource groups here that are inactive. And then we get into Halcyon. Halcyon has included various, they have the concept of templates or some special monitoring, like in the case of Mimics, which there's an extra fee for that. But in the case of some of the other products, it's just kind of built in because it's a little bit simpler monitoring, but nonetheless covers the gamut of various options that you have out there from a software and hardware-based replication. And you'll see iCluster out there, iTerra, Mimics, QuickEDD, Maxava, et cetera, and of course Robot HA, which we do in the marketplace. But monitoring is an important part as you bring together high availability. You can't just assume that it's always there. And even in the case of PowerHA, although it's advertised as less monitoring, doesn't mean that you don't have to look at it periodically. So to make that even easier, at Help Systems, we've added in Insight. Insight is something that we've had in the marketplace for about 5 years now. It is free technology that has dashboard capabilities. And what Insight has is the ability to build SQL monitors to monitor things like PowerHA, and or in this case here, we have Robot HA. So the idea is this is a image inside of PowerPoint, but if I bring up my actual dashboard here, we'll see PowerHA down here where things are active. And if we wanted to, we're not monitoring in this particular test environment. I'm not monitoring everything I should be with admin domain just because of our test environment. But you can see what's not being monitored, for instance, by admin domain. And then in this case here, I have a case where Robot HA is having some issues. I can drill in and see, what are the libraries that are having problems in this particular environment that I need to dig into and see what the problems are and when they were last in sync. So then the other aspect of it is too, is I have, the systems that I'm talking to here and what status they're in. But the idea is inside Robot HA, or I'm sorry, inside of Insight, we have a thing called Insight Analytics, where we can build out our own queries to go and build information. I know Brian's team in development have done a great job of including different SQL services in there. You saw BRMS in there, but here we have PowerHA queries that are just built into here. And Brian, again, has done a good job with his team in documenting those. So that's what I had to share there. Let's get back to the PowerPoint before we get into Q&A here. Let's talk about, how can we help you with high availability? One of the typical things that I do at Help Systems is I have a lot of conversations with customers just on all these different things. And we have a one-on-one conversation to kind of go through what makes sense for you. So at Help Systems, if you have our Robot HA product, we do help you through role swaps. Maybe you want a one-on-one demo on Robot HA. Maybe you need better monitoring for your HA environment. Maybe you have separate monitoring tools. You want to bring these things together into one spot where you monitor everything else. We can help you out with that. Would you like a one-on-one discussion about PowerHA? We also have those conversations directly with customers. We generally bring in a business partner with that because we don't necessarily do the implementation of PowerHA, but we do work on the development for IBM. And then another thing I do with our customers is just schedule a technology update, and we can make that as part of our discussion around high availability. What else is new at Help Systems? What are some other things that are on your mind when it comes to your IT environment? We help customers out with all kinds of things. So we'll just leave that polling question up here as we roll into a little wrap up on what we covered today in about 45 minutes thus far before we get into Q&A. We covered the options for HA or DR on IBM I. We should probably always add that in there. We showed you how to navigate PowerHA. Brian did a wonderful job on that. I took you through the navigating of journal-based replication, and then we showed you some different options for monitoring your high availability DR environment. And I believe Ian has some questions out there for us too, possibly.
Sure. Anybody who have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A panel. We answer your questions as they come in. I will say, while we're waiting for that to happen, there were some questions about a replay in the handout from the presentation that we just watched that will be available on Commons Learning Management System. I will send out an email to everybody who registered for this event. Once that's available, it should be out tomorrow morning. Tom, Brian, this first question is, we know logical replication products, mimics, et cetera, tend to take some percentage of overhead resources in terms of CPU, memory, IO on the system. Does PowerHA have similar requirements, and how much overhead in percentage is needed for PowerHA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things with PowerHA is because it is working at the block level, it generally requires less CPU resources and so forth. When we look at technologies where PowerHA is integrating with external storage to do the replication, that is a very, very minimal CPU intensive thing because that replication is being handled by something else. When we go more towards the internal storage-based replication with something like geographic mirroring, you do have the system kind of taking on some of that replication workload, and you might, we don't have any kind of hard and fast thing because of course it depends on what size your system is, but you may see something in that line of like that 10% CPU overhead for that replication in those instances.
Hey, Brian, this is Tom. If I could add in too, a couple other things to think about with PowerHA is you still do journal your database on the local system, okay? So you do use that information for rebuilding. And the other thing to think about PowerHA is there's a little more overhead on the communication network. So if your COM environment is weak or it doesn't really keep up to date with a tool like a Mimics or some other product out there, then that could be a problem. And then no two software-based replications are the same either. Mimics does have a tendency to do a lot more on the production system than some of the other tools out there, and so has a little bit more overhead. And a lot of that's just due to the number of audits and stuff that people are running just to make sure that their software replication's in sync. And those are some things I think that might be maybe even older practices, Brian, that happened in years before because of the communication connections and things like that weren't quite as reliable. Thank you, Ian, for that question. Unless Brian, do you have anything else? Any rebuttals on that? I hopefully it said that, stated that correctly on PowerHA.
Yep, that all sounds great.
Okay.
All right, again, the Q&A panel. It's on the frame. If you're in frames view, it's on the left thing. Hit the Q&A panel and select and send in your questions now. This next one is, if a certain object is deleted on an HA system, how does the production system and the software handle it?
Well, with journal-based replication, typically what I just talked about were audits. People will run audits from the production system that will verify that the objects on the source side equal the objects on the target side. They might run that depending upon availability, the risk here. They'll run it for sure at least once a week. Some people run those things every single day to audit and look at that. The other thing I would also encourage the customer, whoever asked that question, is that they should really take a deeper look into their security and what they're doing on their target system. Typically, one of our recommendations would be you disable all user accounts over there, except for maybe a few admin accounts that have access to that system, and or you have proper security at the object level, so that you know, the developers or the programmers that you're worried about, I'm hoping it's not an end user that deleted an object, you know, so that we limit what they can do. That would be my thought on that.
And when it does come to PowerHA, since PowerHA is kind of an active passive technology, as far as the independent auxiliary storage pool goes, you really don't have access to your data on your target system until you switch to it, unless you were to say stop the replication and bring the independent ASP up on both systems. But then when you're ready to start up replication again, you end up picking essentially which system you want to keep your data on, and it gets overwritten with the one you choose to keep.
Okay, this next question is, with our current logical replication product, when we do a reorganization of a physical file to drop records, the target system will fall behind in the applies. This causes us to periodically pause the reorganization so the target does not get too far behind. Does Robot HA have the same issue? And he specifies these are large files with billions of rows.
Yeah, I mean, that's it depends. And I could see a similar issue depending upon how much volume you have. I just, you know, without actually setting up a similar test environment, it really comes down to the speed of the communication line, the ability for, well, actually, that would be a process. It's kind of a single entry when you reorg a file. So, and how long it takes to replay. There is going to be a similar impact of that. Part of it's going to be on, you know, how much processor is the processor the same then between the two systems? Is the storage the same? I mean, there are many things that impact a reorg versus, you know, some of the other different record level type operations that happen. So you certainly are going to see a similar delay. I don't know what would be the impact on PowerHA, Brian, with a reorg function.
So with PowerHA, a lot of what it depends, you know, a lot of what anything depends on in terms of your replication is how many changes are happening on disk. And then it really goes back to that question, Tom, that you posed earlier about your communication pipe and how quickly we can push those over. But there isn't that kind of same concept necessarily of having to replay things on the other side, because we're just taking what you did on the production system and moving it across the communication line.
Yeah, I would think that the reorg function is really more of, you know, the issue is more of a timeliness of the reorg as it runs on the target side. You know, when is it, you know, it starts pretty much simultaneously because it's a one entry kind of function that's happening, you know, but you know, that how many transactions are being sent over is not as more, it's more of a processor based issue. I got a feeling with this particular account. but certainly willing to get together if you want to have a one-on-one session and talk further on that. I think it's very specific to your environment that we'd want to drill a little further into where you're spending your time. And the other thing I should really offer up on that area is the thought of taking a look at a tool like Performance Navigator, where we can take a look at where you're spending time, and we can maybe make suggestions on some things to think about when that reorg is running, because we do analyze performance issues on IBM I, and this would certainly fit in that realm. And then we have comment in here: processor, memory, IO, volume of database, network bandwidth should be all variables to be considered. I would agree with that comment. Thank you for putting that in there.
All right, last chance for any final questions. While we're waiting for a minute, I will state again that if you need a replay or a handout of the presentation slides that Brian and Tom worked through and talked us through this afternoon, it will be available on the Learning Management System on the Common Learning Management later in the day. Tomorrow morning at the latest, I'll send out an email once that's available. All right, seeing no more questions, Tom and Brian, thank you for a good presentation.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure working with the Common organization.
All right, everybody have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.